as I'm talking. Feel free to use the chat and put the question in there. I'm going to try to leave about maybe 10 minutes at the end to make sure, and I will just kind of go through those questions and see if I can answer them. So just let you know that if you've got something that's on your mind, go ahead and put it in there. I probably won't be looking at it as I'm presenting, but I will get to it, even if I have to cut some content. So we're going to talk about some of the cultural problems that we see about masculinity. I'll introduce a little bit about this idea about positive psychology, which might be new for some folks. And then I really want to get into some of the myths about masculinity and what we can do to help challenge some of those myths and then support the well-being of boys and men. I love this quote by a Nigerian writer, Chimamanda Adichie. So the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but that they're incomplete. And so they make only one story become the whole story. And so I want you to think about the stereotypes that you might have about boys and men that we see in the news media, in our social media, in the stories that we read, the films that we see, and to kind of challenge the idea of whether we're only getting one story and we don't always get that full picture. And I'll talk a little bit about why, and I think many of you probably know why. I always like to give a really quick intro on gender differences because we often get really excited, I think, when we see a headline where research shows some difference. I learned in graduate school something called the iron rule of gender differences in research. And what that means is there is more diversity and variability within a group than there are between groups. And so I use this slide here to show if we were looking at height, on average, human males are several inches taller than the average human female. And so you can say, well, that's an interesting difference. But what's more interesting is there's a much bigger difference between shorter males and then taller males. And so a lot of psychology that has looked at gender differences has found that we're actually similar in about 95% of the studies on different variables about beliefs and thoughts and skills and all that kind of stuff. So I want you to hold that in mind. Even though the news media often gets very excited about these small and sometimes not so meaningful differences. The other thing is our brains aren't wired to be able to process statistics very well. We have to work hard to do it. And just because we might know 60% of people in this group might have a certain behavior, it actually doesn't mean that we know anything about one person in that group. So if we plucked somebody randomly out of that demographic category or something like that, we aren't any better at predicting just because we know they're a member of that group. So that's another thing that's sometimes hard to hold. So I always ask people to try to hold these two things in their head at the same time. And then the other thing is if you're here and you've got a brain, which all of you do, it's going to be prone to certain cognitive biases. There's about 12 to 24 that we see in research pretty predictably. I'm just going to share two. I don't know how prevalent this is across the globe. I know in the US culture, there's a stereotype that males are better drivers than females. Now, I'm first going to challenge that to say it can't be true because we pay more for car insurance, because we have more tickets, we get more car accidents, so we're actually riskier drivers. But the way an attentional bias works is if I believe that to be true, as I'm driving down the road, maybe 1,000 cars pass me, maybe somebody does something I'm not happy with, or they slow down in front of me. If I believe that, if I have that bias that women are worse drivers, if I notice there's a female driver, I might say, see, I'm right, even though I ignored maybe all the other bad driving that happened around me. And so sometimes our attention drives us to seek out information. So that certainly happens with stereotypes about men and masculinity. There's also something called the correspondence bias, where we often will attribute our own behaviors to something about us, about our personalities internally, the situation. And then when we see somebody else outside do that same behavior, we'll say it's because of their personality. So if I maybe get aggressive during a football match, I can say, I'm not an aggressive person, I'm aggressive because the situation called for it. Even though I might see somebody else do the exact same behavior and say, well, they're just an aggressive person, and I'll ignore some of the environmental factors around it. We do this a lot with gender as well. So I just want to kind of point these things out to raise your awareness of when we're thinking about things that people do as it relates to gender, that these things are often at play. And so sometimes we need to pause and challenge ourselves. So these are some magazine covers over the last couple of years here. I don't know and I know for a lot of Western cultures, we're seeing kind of similar things where there's a crisis of masculinity. The World Health Organization did a really giant study on the global burden of disease, and they found that These 6 behaviors account for more than half of male deaths and almost 3/4 of male morbidity. So you can see things right here. If you look at rate ratio, so these would be sex differences, males much higher likelihood of alcohol use, drug use, getting injured on the job, tobacco use, and then even poor diet. And so this is just to show you this is we're seeing some of these results globally. So I want to make sure I spread things out, and it's not just the research that we're doing here in the States. If you look at global samples, about a third of men, adult men, are not working. They complete suicides on average at 4 times the rate of women. They are twice as likely to die from drug or overdoses, and the mortality gap is anywhere from 5 to 13 years. It's 5 in the United States, and it's up to 13 years in Russia, and then it varies kind of elsewhere across the globe. And so these are some of the things that we think about, concerns or problems with boys and men that kind of keep me up at night and keep me interested in this field. Now, some people will say, well, there's some of this biological risk. We have X-linked differences, hormone differences that might make men more at risk for certain types of diseases, and that is true. But that only accounts for about 20% of that gap. So that might be in the United States, that's only 1 of those 5 years. And so then the question is, what explains the other 4-year differences? And that tends to be things that we think of as psychosocial. So our behaviors, our attitudes, the things that we do, our approaches to problem solving, our approaches to emotions, and those types of things. So that's really what I'm going to focus on today. But I want to acknowledge that there certainly are reasons that there might be some biological risk. And we know that those things interact as well. So it's not just as simply this is biological, this is psychosocial, but those things interact in something we call epigenetics. So I'm going to introduce this term, and you might know it in maybe a slightly different terminology, this idea of social constructionism. Because when I look at gender, when I research gender, I take it from this social constructionist perspective. That means societies create reality by the way we interact with each other. And oftentimes you've got expressed rules, ones that, you should be doing this and you should not. And then sometimes those are not expressed, they're implicit. We're just supposed to kind of understand those. In the United States, we have an interesting relationship to math education. And so we tell people that some people are good at math and some aren't. We don't require everybody studies calculus. That is not true of all cultures. There are cultures where everybody's expected to learn calculus, and then the education system believes in that. I think that's, for me, a really good argument. Unless you have a learning disability related to mathematics, most humans can learn calculus under the right circumstances. But when we have beliefs about whether we can or cannot, for whatever reason, that can certainly get in the way of whether we pursue that path or think we can do it. Social construction exists because of language and the words that we use to describe things. And so masculinity exists because we agree that it has some specific meaning and significance. Even though, and this is hard for us because we live relatively short lives, meanings change over time. So I have this image of a 16th or 17th century royalty at the height of masculinity. Wearing high-heeled shoes, tights, long flowing robes, long wigs. That was associated with strength and masculinity and leadership. That doesn't reflect right now necessarily how we would do it. And so history kind of moves in and out of different ways that it allows different genders to express themselves. In the United States, right now, pink and blue. So if somebody finds out they're pregnant with a girl, oftentimes pink is the color that they get things in, and blue is for boys. But I always point out to my students, for much of Western history, red and pink were masculine colors because they were the color of blood, or they were derivatives of blood. And blue was kind of light and airy like the sky and was associated with femininity. But there were some marketing consultants back in the mid 1920s that kind of chose these colors and started consulting with department stores in the United States. And within a matter of decades, they've now created pink and blue to mean something about gender, even though they themselves don't inherently mean, colors aren't associated at all with gender, but we've created that expectation, at least in our culture. So I'd encourage you too to think about wherever your home culture is from, how masculinity is constructed and how it might change over time and what it means. So the reason this is important, I like this metaphor a colleague of mine had come up with. If you want to change it, three things are important you have to have. So think about your own smartphones that you have. There are a lot of different settings. All right, you can change all kinds of color, size, everything else, but it requires three things to do so. One is you have to be aware that that you've got that option, that you can maybe turn it into night mode or something like that. But that's also not enough. You might know that you can change something, but you might not be motivated to do so. So you also then have to be motivated in some reason. There has to be a good reason for me to want to change this idea of, in this case, they say masculinity. And that also is not enough, because you may say, yeah, I sure would like to maybe be more in touch with my ability to express emotions to my romantic partner or something like that. But you also then have to have the ability, the skill, like to know how to change it. So a lot of the work that I do is helping, like this is about raising awareness, probably more. Maybe there's some motivation in there as well. We likely won't get to the ability and skill, but that would be up to you if you decided that I want to do, have a different relationship to masculinity here. And I'm going to give credit to my wife here. She came up with this metaphor. I don't like the term toxic masculinity. Some of you have probably heard it. I like the term restrictive masculinity, this idea that if boys and men exist in this very restrictive way of interacting, like they're only allowed to express certain emotions and they're only allowed to do certain things, that to me, you only have a couple options, or you have a couple tools at your disposal. I use the term expansive masculinity to help encourage clients to think about, it's not about getting rid of this pair of scissors. I'm not asking you to give up some of the ways that you've learned to be male in your culture. What I'm suggesting is that you learn some additional ways of being, because wouldn't it be nice if we could be flexible across different settings and different human relationships? Because oftentimes I'll have clients that might fear that I'm trying to take away who they are. And I said, that's not at all. I'm trying to help expand your ideas about what gender can mean and give you a lot more options when you're interacting with others. And so I told you I want to just briefly introduce this idea of positive psychology. So up until about the year 2000, most of the psychologists have focused on what I would call the minus or the negative side of human experience. So if this is the midpoint in the middle, 0, it's about, can I help remove somebody's depressive symptoms? Can I remove their anxiety symptoms? Can kind of bring them back to midpoint. But when you ask people about their human experience, most of us don't say, I want to just not be depressed, or I want to just not be anxious. We say, I also want to experience love and compassion and gratitude and those positive emotions. So this field of positive psychology now has been around for 20 years, looking at kind of the positive side of human experiences and trying to encourage ways to help support people in those. And as a result, some folks in my field came along and developed this idea of positive masculinity. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but they came up with these 10 ideas that we should celebrate some male relational styles, that they engage in a lot of shared activities with each other. They might show care in different ways, something called action empathy. When they see somebody suffering, they want to go in and help remove that and do what they can to solve a problem. Generative fatherhood, helping develop kids into healthy humans. Self-reliance, connected with others, but can still, when they need to, kind of step up and get things done. A value in being a worker or a provider, where they get meaning from work and provide for themselves or the families if they have those. I call this calculated risk taking, taking sensible risks that help advance their lives and the lives of others, not risky or foolish ones. That there's oftentimes group orientation, having some type of identity to a community, whether that's a sports community or a work community or neighborhood. A norm for service, serving others. Connecting through humor. A lot of my research, when I've asked about some male strengths, a lot will talk about using that to help through healing and coping. And then lastly, heroism, not just in the sense of putting themselves at risk in extreme situations, but just overcoming obstacles. So these are some of the concepts that exist in a field called positive masculinity. So again, I just want to kind of introduce some of the problems that we see with masculinity and maybe some of the helpful ways to think about it differently. I've kind of settled on this for my definition. I always say you can express whatever version of masculinity works for you as long as it meets 2 criteria. it doesn't harm self, and it doesn't harm others. And I think if we can learn to look at gender that way, we can be a lot more inclusive and supportive of our own experiences and those experiences of others as well. All right. So I will pause though, if there are any questions here in the chat about any of that content that I just went over, feel free to put that in there, and then I'll get to it again later. So for most of this presentation, I really want to focus on some of the myths and ideas that we might have culturally about some of the things that boys and men might experience as a result of masculine pressure. So if we were all together, I'd release a poll on here to do it on anonymously. But what I want you to do, I'm gonna show you some statements or ask you some questions. I just want you to reflect on what your kind of gut or automatic answer to that question would be. You don't have to share it. This is really just being kind of reflecting. And so how many of you have heard or believe it to be true that body image or body dissatisfaction is largely a female problem? So there's been a lot of research in the last 15, 20 years into men's body image. And this is a study that was done with, we call them either middle school or early high school boys. So they met in groups with interviewers, and they asked them about body image. And you'll hear these are some of the quotes from that study that they're saying these are not topics for conversation. You wouldn't want to do them because you'd be afraid of appearing gay or girly. You're on your own. You're a bit a girl if you talk about that body image stuff. We don't talk about looks. We might say, hey, that's a pretty cool hat. But you don't actually talk about how guys look. So you've got adolescents in that developmental stage saying, yeah, this is a thing, but if it's a thing for you, there's nobody to talk to about it because there'll be social consequences to doing so. And so oftentimes, we're wondering, where does this stuff come from? There's been 50 years or more of research on female body image. And so we know where it comes from. A lot of the media that we consume, whether that's film, social media, images, and print, magazines, those types of things. And now that we're seeing similar things happening to boys and men, just maybe in a slightly different direction. So I'll show you some imagery of superheroes and video game folks. So here was, even this was, quite large physique. This is a more modern view. Look at just the difference in 2 decades of the size of the figurine and the muscles on the body. So that's Superman, comic book Superman. This was the original Superman, Christopher Reeve. This is the newer one. So you can even see, this was just basically spandex, form-fitting. This we've got fake abs and kind of built into this plastic suit to show muscle more pronounced. This was an early Batman figurine, and you can see 20 years later what Batman looks like. So imagine little children playing 30 years ago with their Batman figurine versus 30 years later. Kind of all these subtle signals about what masculinity looks like. This was Adam West in the 1960s, and then this was The Dark Knight. And again, you see just a radical change in the way the body is portrayed in the movies, in the films there. This would have been a game. This was a game when I was younger called Street Fighter, and you can see just over 5 sequences, the 2 characters got much bigger and much more muscular as the video games released over times in the 1980s and the early 90s. These were considered kind of early sex symbols in Hollywood in the 1970s. And you can see body hair, largely fairly lean. A couple of years ago, these were some of the top earning Hollywood actors. We got Dwayne Johnson, Channing Tatum, and then we've got an Indian actor, Salman Khan. So you can see these individuals have probably 5 to 8% body fat and quite a bit of muscle mass. And so you got to ask yourself, what are the consequences of this? If we know this is happening to girls in exposure to media for a long time, how is it impacting boys and men as well? So is men's body image really a problem? Some of the best research on this has actually come out of the UK. So they've been studying this for a number of years in other countries in Western Europe. men's body image dissatisfaction has tripled just in the last 25 years. And so now almost half of Western men are reporting it. I just read a study on kind of across the lifespan in Great Britain and showed that the highest risk group are males in their late or mid 30s to mid 40s. And so you can see there is a clear effect. If you look at the United States, men spending on cosmetic surgery, so paying a surgeon to change their appearance, went from 88 million to 500 million. And you can see an example of, and it's much higher now, but you can see some of the things, removing fat, changing the shape of their nose, chest implants, chin surgery, and even penis enlargement. So clearly, if you want to look at outcomes on men modifying their bodies, we're seeing an impact of this exposure to media. So about a 2/3 of an increase in the number of procedures just in a 7-year period, even from 2000 to 2007. When I was in graduate school, so this would have been 20 years ago, learning about body image, at that time, only about 5 to 10% of people being treated for eating disorders in clinics, in hospital settings. Only about 5 to 10% were male. Most recently, it's jumped up to about 25%. So they now make up a quarter of people who are seeking treatment for diagnosable eating disorders. I will still make the argument, because part of my research is in men's help seeking, that that's probably undercounting the number of boys and men who are experiencing it because they tend not to report it or not seek help for it. So I suspect it's larger than 25%. That's a very significant gain in some of those problem behaviors just in a very short amount of time. There's a whole area of research called that assesses boys and men's attitudes about muscles and lean mass. And so it's called Drive for Muscularity. And so the folks that research this have found people that score higher on this, on idealized muscles, tend to report lower self-concept or self-esteem. They have higher rates of depression, feelings of isolation and social anxiety, and they're at a greater risk for abusing things like anabolic steroids to help kind of improve muscle mass. And McCreary and Sauce are two big names in this field. It looks like it's getting worse for adolescent boys and men. Again, we had a big problem with this about a decade ago, an increase in non-prescription weight loss medication. So we see it here even at our university. So college students, males taking stuff like ephedrine and nervous system amphetamines. And then when that interacts with a lot of physical activity or extreme heat, can result in cardiac failure. So we're seeing a lot more non-prescription weight loss medication use as well. So kind of off-label. So I want to kind of drive home this idea that we already know and understand the risks of exposure to girls and women, and we still haven't fixed that. Anybody who's seen the reports on Facebook and Instagram. But we also, it's important to consider what we're doing with boys and men too, and teaching them about the impacts. We call it media literacy. What can we do to help them understand the influence of some of this imagery on their sense of well-being and their safety. I'll talk a little bit about emotions. And so some of you, again, there's cultural differences here, but some of you may have heard that girls and women are generally more emotional than boys and men. When I poll this in audiences, oftentimes there's general agreement on that. So I want to talk a little bit about that, particularly as a clinician. Things that we consider unmasculine, so boys crying, often get disapproved by parents, and so they're more likely to be punished for expressing emotions like sadness, particularly once they pass the age of 4 or 5. And it tends to really be punished when they become school-aged and they start to go to primary school. Male peer groups are especially effective and sometimes brutal in enforcing those ideas. And so we can see extremes in all male groups, maybe around sports teams, Greek organizations or fraternal organizations, or gangs as well, that anybody who kind of steps out can experience some punishment as a result. I do want to point out, though, that for many men, restricting emotions is cross-situational, meaning they learn the places where it's not safe to do so, but there might be somebody in their life where they actually feel like they can do that. So I don't want to suggest that boys and men aren't doing it in certain places, but they're certainly doing it a lot less because of that fear of disapproval socially. I also want to point out that this is not universal. So this varies widely by culture. So Margaret Mead was a cultural anthropologist that did a lot of different studies of tribal societies. And I just pulled up too the Arapesh, where there are no gender differences in emotional expression. So independent of your gender, everybody's allowed to express a similar range of emotions. When we look in the United States and look at gender differences in emotional expression, we even have some racial and ethnic differences. We tend to see things like males are allowed to display pride and anger and tend to at higher rates. And women are allowed to display a whole lot of other ones in addition to those. The Chambri, according to Western standards, their gender roles are actually reversed as far as emotional expression goes. So I really want to point this out, because if you haven't had the opportunity to spend time or live in another culture, sometimes we can think this is the way things are. But they're the way things are because that's what our culture at this time has agreed the way things are. It doesn't mean that we're universally incapable of emotional expression. So I'm going to set up this clip. I think the volume should work for you. This was a popular, more of an adult cartoon in the United States called King of the Hill. And I use this to kind of introduce this idea of emotional restriction. So this is Uncle Hank. His niece has recently broken up with her boyfriend, and she's coming to him to ask for some support in coping with it or dealing with it. I realize some of this might get lost in translation culturally, but I want to kind of make a point about the way he approaches this idea of emotions. So hopefully you can hear this. So I use that as just kind of a slightly humorous way to think about the way that we socialize boys and men to think about sad emotions. And so you hear Hank saying that rather than experience and express it, we should just kind of put all that stuff on the inside. And he says something pretty profound. I'm a clinical health psychologist, and my specialty really is in physical health and chronic stress management and that kind of stuff. He talks about putting in the pit of the stomach and feeling kind of sick. A lot of our stress-related disorders can link to this idea of not giving time and space for emotional expression. So I also want to point out there's a difference between internal experience and then external expression. So it's quite likely many of us have had internal experiences, but we've chosen not to express those. So we have some control over them. And there are some cultural beliefs that women are, quote unquote, more emotional than men. Now, I've got equipment in my lab that measures nervous system arousal, so kind of your stress response. And I've done studies where I expose people to stressors, and then I also ask them to report on their stress. We know that there's little evidence to suggest that men experience less emotion than women. It's happening in their bodies. Their nervous system is registering something happening, even if they on the outside are saying, I feel fine. And so it's not necessarily that the experience is different, but what we're kind of culturally allowed or given ourselves permission to express. So oftentimes I'll hear people say, well, I refuse to, or I'm not going to experience that pain. I'm going to kind of shut that out. I'm just going to power through it. We now have a lot of research. If any of you are familiar with the social worker Brene Brown, she now has about 50,000 pieces of data, humans that have responded to interviews about this. And they have found that if you can't selectively numb emotions. So if you say, I'm not going to experience some of these vulnerable emotions like fear or sadness or powerlessness, when you do that, you are also numbing yourself to joy and love and gratitude and those types of things. So you don't get one without the other. It's kind of a both and situation. And so right now, what I'm really interested in actually is boys and men's experience of joy and being socialized away from the expression of that, because it relates to shutting down some of these negative emotions. So I want to introduce this thing called the male emotional funnel system that Gondolf had introduced back in the 80s, that humans are born into the world with this full range of emotions, and males traditionally, as they age up through adolescence, we go through a little bit of a funnel system. And so we say, you're not allowed to express fear. You're not allowed to say that you're ashamed. You can't talk about being lonely. or embarrassed. And by late adolescence, early adulthood, sometimes the only thing left is the expression of anger. And so when I work with anger with clients, I've always been very clear. I say, it might be anger, like anger serves a purpose, but I'm often like, what was the emotion that you experienced microseconds before anger? And we spend our time kind of slowing down that process. Oftentimes you discover that it's these things, but they haven't been able to express them in a safe environment without shame. And so then we'll sometimes default to anger. And so there's been very clear research of what happens when we avoid vulnerability. Decreased sensitivity to our own internal states. If we can't do that ourselves, it's often very difficult to understand the feeling states of others. We might even get confused or intolerant of other people's expression and get frustrated by it. Like, how can why are you crying? Why are you feeling that way? We tend to overvalue the rational. Rational can be extremely helpful. So can emotions. The Buddhists call it wise mind. So it's a combination of those two things. But oftentimes, if we socialize people in kind of these traditional or restrictive ideas about masculinity, we overvalue the rational, undervalue the emotional. Then people learn to disguise their true feelings, hide them. Clearly, if you can't read the emotions of others and accurately display your own, it makes it very difficult to have committed relationships that could be friendships or romantic. And then when it gets really bad, we start to see increased rates of numbing through substance use. It could be overwork, video game play. So earlier when I was talking about that mortality gap, a big part of, and then the increased risk of drug use, some of it has to do with numbing and avoiding some of these experiences when we don't give boys and men the space and the tools to do so. And then lastly, which I mentioned, that kind of Hank Hill example, is it can contribute to stress-related disorders, cardiovascular health. We even know from cardiovascular studies that the open expression of anger increases calcium deposits on your arteries. So quite literally decreases the elasticity of your blood vessels and increases your risk for high blood pressure. So we even see physiological risk associated with the open expression of anger and cynicism. So I always introduce this idea. I think many of us are born into the world with a full box of crayons. If you think about these as emotions, we might have 8 different shades of red. And then through socialization, we might end up as young adult males only having 8 crayons left: mad, glad, sad, right, angry. And so my goal is always to encourage people and try to support them into returning actually back to that state of having a better vocabulary and understanding of some of the nuance of our emotional experience, and not getting kind of locked into just a couple of the things that society tells us that we're allowed to have. All right. This kind of relates here a little bit. We've got a lot of myths too about our relationships to others as males. And so let a number pop into your head. How many times per hour does the average male think of sex? Every once in a while, there's like a headline in a newspaper about that. So some really creative researchers years ago went out and tested this. And so they gave undergraduates, at the time they were beepers, that would go off at random times and then have them check whether or not they were thinking about one of 3 things: sex, food, or sleep. And what they found was, yes, there were median differences for men versus women, 19 versus 10, a longer range, but it comes out to about 1 to 2 times per hour, even though headlines were saying 10 times a minute or whatever. But they also found that male undergrads were more likely to think about food and sleep more often. And so they thought, like, what is that about? Well, it turns out, I should say, the best predictor of whether somebody thought about sex was just comfort with sexuality. It was independent of what their gender was. So they explained this through men are often socialized to attend to their own needs. Women are often socialized in our culture to attend to others. And there's something called objectification theory that supports that. And so this really means that there's a lot more going on inside our heads than sex. And so to try to dispel that myth or that stereotype that that's the only thing that males are thinking about. Many of you have probably heard some of the evolutionary theory that men go for the attractive partner, women are going to go for partners with the most resources. There have been several studies that have looked at this. This is a global sample. So in the late 70s, they found that physical attractiveness was in the bottom half of characteristics when they're asking about heterosexual attraction. And when they asked women, financial prospects were in the bottom half as well. This was repeated again decades later and found pretty similar. So despite the stereotype, the evidence actually wasn't that supported. Instead, what they found was that they were similar. The things people want, people with dependable character, that are mature to some degree, that have just a pleasing disposition or a way that they interact, and that they feel some mutual attraction to them. And so this is a way I'll help dispel this myth. We want similar things in romantic partners. And so this idea that there's some drastic difference here just isn't really supported when you start actually asking people about it. I want to talk a little too about gender expression in sexual identity, and sometimes the confusion between those things. And so sometimes there's stereotypes about gay men and boys being less masculine than straight boys and men. And so a couple researchers surveyed gay and straight respondents about their non-traditional gender experiences during childhood. So, preferences for toys, activities that they would do, those types of things. And Harry found that about 40% of the gay sample reported non-traditional experiences, but almost 1 in 10 of heterosexual samples also were nonconformist. A little bit later, Bell did some additional research and found that in their sample, about half of gay male participants said they had some gender incongruent or non-traditional gender interests, but among straight males, it was now up to about a quarter. And so I encourage people too to think about the stereotypes that we make about people based on their sexual orientation. And so I ran some calculations for ETH Zurich. So you got about 23,000 undergrads, about 2/3 of them are male. So if you have about 15,000 males, and if we assume some of the research that shows about 6% of human males will identify as same-sex attracted or gay, that means that we've got 500 non-conforming gay men and over 3,000 non-conforming straight men. And so there's no value in making assumptions about people just based on the way they choose to express gender, and yet we do that culturally. And so it means we have a lot of different ways that we can express it independent of sexual orientation. And then I always ask the question, what's it matter to you anyway? But as a culture, sometimes we seem to be hung up on some of that stuff. So the last concept or myth I want to talk about is violence. And so these are some phrases that we have in the US culture. When we see maybe a boy engage in some rough play and say, oh, boys will be boys, it's in men's nature to be aggressive. This is an area I really want to point out. Return to that attentional bias that I talked about at the beginning, where if all we see are headlines that of violence, we can start to make associations, and we start to over predict how violent maybe a place is or people are. We certainly do that with masculinity. There have been a lot of studies on campus sexual assault, and in one study, it was 6% of men that were responsible for most, if not almost all, of acquaintance sexual assault with multiple victims. And so I always make it clear, while I use this example too, while men may perpetrate acts of physical violence, most men are not physically violent. So it tends to be done by a small number of males relative to the whole. But those aren't the headlines that catch our attention. We don't pay attention to the 80 to 90% of people who are expressing gender in healthy and adaptive ways. Also want to point out that sometimes violence is confined to very narrow settings for men, if their safety is at risk. And so it's not that it's always widespread. And this is a hard truth, particularly in the United States. There's a lot of cross-cultural variation. And so Sande had done a study back in the 80s with a scale that kind of assessed something called rape proneness and attitudes about misogyny and those types of things, attitudes towards women, and found that there are quite a few non-patriarchal societies where it's virtually non-existent. And so again, we got to go back to the idea about social construction. How is it that we think about gender and talk about gender in ways that might increase the risk for some of these behaviors? And are there things that we can do to help decrease risk? Which brings me to this last piece of content here on violence. When I do workshops on this, oftentimes in our societies, we have law enforcement, we have court systems, we have ways to help deal with or punish the worst expressions of violence through homicide. And yet it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so down here, these things exist because they rely on the support of other things below them. So if you, let's say maybe for whatever reason, you might be at risk for, going up the pyramid here, it starts with expressing some of these attitudes and beliefs in social circles. And if nobody challenges you on them, you might just say, okay, well, I can maybe kind of up the intensity a little bit, or you might start to seek out other people who support those belief systems. And it moves on from just kind of thinking or believing these things to start making jokes about it. And then, as you can see, that risk increases. So when I do workshops, I usually bring a bunch of cups that I stack up and I give a ball to the audience and I say, if you wanted to knock down this pyramid, what's going to be the most effective way? And the best way to knock down a pyramid is to take out that lower part, right? This stuff's important. It's important that we focus on that. But if we want to really take care of this, we need to start at this level. And this is that awareness and that motivation level that I showed you earliest. So what can we do about gender? What can we do to help create subcultures and cultures that are, create or enhance expansive ideas about masculinity? I'm just share a couple of my own. I don't use the B word in English. It refers to women. And so I have two daughters. And part of me is I don't want them growing up in a world where this is a word that's used to describe them when maybe somebody's frustrated with them or if they're expressing or asserting themselves. So to think about the language that we use that might help support some of that stuff. This may feel like a small thing, but for me, I've chosen to do it. If right now in the U.S., McKelley, a hip hop artist, recently found guilty of a lot of charges. A lot of people are asking the record companies to stop playing his music as a result. Some are saying if you're going to play it, then you need to be donating to relief funds for victims of sexual violence. And so, how do we spend our money? Are we supporting some of these negative messages? No matter what course I teach, no matter what the topic is, I find ways to talk about gender and its relationship to those concepts. And I realize this will be different for everybody. I'm also a parent, as I mentioned, and so I think about how do I model healthy masculinity, and am I withholding emotions around my daughters because I don't want them to see me feel a certain way. So these are all like little things that we can do. Sometimes that's the biggest impact we have is on our small social connections or networks. So I just want to share a couple things with you all, and then it looks like we will have time to do a little bit of Q&A. These are just kind of general ideas. What are things that boys and men can do? One of them, stop accepting that just being nice is enough, because sometimes guys will be like, well, I don't do that. But that's the bare minimum. And so if you're going to support people, support them out of compassion, not just out of this kind of idea about being chivalrous or being nice. Sometimes it's a lot harder to step up. And so I encourage boys and men to do that. Reflect on how some of your own activities might support problematic views. Even if you aren't active in what we call hazing or kind of punishing people in like sports teams or bullying, even if you are not the one doing it, just saying I'm not, but not challenging it, you're still playing a role in it. So thinking about where you are in that and whether or not you're in that pyramid at the bottom. And then this is a hard thing to do, challenge or opt out of hurtful humor, whether it's sexist, ableist, whatever it might be. If we're talking about gender, it's often about sexism. My wife's really good at this. If she's around it and somebody tells a sexist joke, she just kind of looks at him and says, oh, I don't get it. Can you explain that to me? That's one of the most effective ways to shut something down, because then people are kind of forced to try to explain why they think that thing is funny. And I know this varies from culture to culture as well, even within the United States. Sometimes people laugh because they don't want to hurt the other person's feelings. Well, then that other person learns that this joke's okay to tell. And so they might tell it in another environment. And so think about what role that you might have in a social situation to maybe challenge and help minimize some of that behavior. And sometimes people in my classes, my masculinities class will ask, well, what can I do? I'm not male identified. Expect and ask more out of boys and men in your life, understanding some of the barriers to it, and not just saying, I really wish he would, communicate more, but really knowing that they're capable of it under the right conditions and supporting them in doing that. And reflect on how your own activities might support problematic views. When I teach this in my masculinities class, right now that it's usually about it's most, half female identified, half male. I usually have a couple trans and gender non-conforming students in the class. And oftentimes by the end of it, we'll have a discussion about, I'll ask the students, last time you saw a male person cry or express emotions, how did you react? And some of them will say, I got really quiet. I didn't know, it was a surprise to me. And they'll start to think about ways that they sometimes might subtly reinforce some of these norms. And so I always encourage people to think about, in your own family systems, friendships, if you're in a romantic relationship, how do you send those subtle cues about what's okay and what's not okay as far as gender expression? And then lastly, and I think I've given lots of examples of this, if we socially construct gender and masculinity through language, one of the ways that we can help change it or deconstruct it is to pay attention to the language that we use to describe it and the things that we do. I often say, start with your low-hanging fruit, right? So the easiest thing to do, most people's friends are not gonna leave you if you kind of challenge or ask them questions about this. So maybe you try being a little different. Maybe try a little vulnerability in your close friendship groups if it doesn't feel safe to do it in other ones. And so count on those people in your life that you already that love and support you. And then lastly, this is a tough one, I realize too, but practicing compassionate social media use. So not supporting and reinforcing some of these harmful images, being a little bit more honest and vulnerable about your experiences, and not just always presenting the most desirable side of yourself or your life. So the thing that I do at the end of everything when I do workshops is ask people to reflect a little bit. You don't have to do this now, but if you've got time afterwards, I want you to choose like one thing that you're going to do differently in your life in the next 30 days. And if you really want to get extra credit for it, commit publicly to somebody. So here's something, I'm going to try not to use this language, or I'm going to try to respond differently in these ways, or I'm going to try to be more honest when you ask me how I'm doing. And so I encourage you to do that at some point when you have some time to reflect. All right, so this is the last quote I leave with. I think this is an Australian author saying, challenging men to be strong without hardness, soft without fear, powerful without oppression, gentle without shame, knowledgeable without arrogance, be nurturing and led with humility, themselves with joy. So I just whipped through that pretty quickly. So I appreciate you hanging, for those of you that are able to hang in there. We do have some time, and so if it's all right with you, I'm going to go look over here. I'll bring the chat over. I'm also going to stop sharing, so at least it feels a little bit more conversational here.
I also stop recording, so like that everyone feels more comfortable asking questions.
Thank you very much.